Hey, it's Olin. It's time to talk about garrisons. Oh boy. The garrison doesn't need an introduction, so to do a retrospective on it is to pretty much review the Warlords of Draenor expansion itself, since it was a feature that cast a shadow over pretty much every area of gameplay, from quests to raids to PvP to pet battles. When I wrote this piece, it was pretty hard to even figure out where to start, so I apologize for the length. I should get some fluff out of the way first. I'm only going to quickly acknowledge what was cut from the garrison, such as the choosable location or renaming followers. This or any other cut content that was originally announced or promised, as some people like to point out, isn't really conducive to a meaningful discussion, so take off those tinfoil hats, guys. I'm not going to go over every single follower building. I'm mostly going to go on the system's overall execution and how it affected gameplay from both inside and outside of the garrison, so I'm still going to talk a lot. Did the garrison deliver on its design? The short answer is yeah. It was a mediocre experience that came at the expense of the rest of the expansion. Or maybe it's the thread that players hung on to because the expansion was going to be like this anyway, but that's it for the speculation. According to this handy-dandy slide, the garrison is a collection of systems designed to introduce a few new gameplay paradigms, like running missions, customizing a base, and offline progression. Let's start with the base itself. The garrison included several different sized nodes where players could set up a building according to their gameplay style or whatever their goal was. Among these were certain nodes that could not be changed, the mine and the herb garden. This idea started back in Mists of Pandaria, where players discovered a farm, worked the land, and got resources from it. By comparison, aside from a quest, the mine and herb garden simply refreshed each day. That's it. From an immersion standpoint, this can be explained, because in Mist, we worked the farm alone. In Warlords, we can presume that some nameless NPC in the garrison worked the garden, and we can clearly see NPCs toiling away inside the mine. But in an MMO, immersion can only hold for so long. Ultimately, these resources were handed to us with almost no work involved. At least we had to travel to Half Hill to work our farm. The mine and the herb garden were just right there for our convenience, which will be a recurring theme throughout this analysis. Small buildings performed a number of functions, but primarily they supplemented professions in Warlords. Just like players used a profession cooldown each day, profession buildings enabled players to queue up work orders, which generated additional profession-related resources over several days. This is the big change from previous expansions, which encouraged players to go out and farm for these resources and materials. On the flip side, it was convenient to maintain cooldowns and work orders. Professions that used the mine and herb garden benefited from this greatly, thanks to its close proximity. Most of the other medium and large buildings help tailor each character for their gameplay, as if you're speccing for raiding or PvP. There was also a sort of economic spec, which used the trading post for turning in excess resources, and the tavern to maximize gold rewards for missions, which I'll get to in a second. The mission system is arguably the most forward-thinking of the garrison systems. The design is simple and it's pretty easy to engineer, but it offers continuous gameplay due to its rewards. It's not just a feature, but a platform that can be built upon, and over the course of the expansion, that's what happened, in the form of additional missions, rewards, and follower requirements. The basics are intuitive enough. You assign the right person for the job and off they go. At the same time, it was reviled for the dull repetition and the lack of gameplay, leading to the creation of add-ons like Master Plan and Garrison Commander. The rewards were compelling enough for many players to go back and check on their missions often. In fact, up until the launch of Hellfire Citadel, players could receive up to mythic raid gear from these missions, which made the mission table outstandingly more powerful of a reward system than anything else available at the time, with the exception of raids themselves. It wasn't long until the metagame of the mission system boiled down to just maximizing gold rewards thanks to the tavern. This also became an extremely easy way for players to amass large amounts of gold, and since the launch of the WoW token, a lot of gold has been exchanging hands. Between work orders and missions is the offline progression paradigm I mentioned earlier. I give this a different description: maintenance over gameplay. Log on, complete and start your missions and work orders, do whatever you're going to do outside of the garrison, and log off. And you know what? That's okay. WoW has always been about making offerings that support wide audiences and varying tastes. This is an attempt to appeal to players who can't digest WoW in large quantities, as well as players who don't. Note the difference there. Fans deride the system for numerous reasons, including its similarities to mobile games, but you can't ignore its appeal to the casual audience, and WoW players are generalized as a casual audience. Some players enjoy very short sessions of gameplay that feel rewarding. I got a lot more to say on this, but I gotta mention the shipyard first. In so few words, the shipyard is an evolution of the original mission table. Instead of randomly respecing traits to optimize followers, instead we found or purchased equipment. It was a little bit more hands-on and it wasn't as easy to trivialize with add-ons, though they were still very useful. The shipyard's table rewards were not as powerful in relation to the garrison table because of other systems that were introduced, but using it was a hard requirement for obtaining the legendary ring, which is kind of interesting. The legendary questline was open to all players and didn't require garrison participation at all, but the shipyard pretty much required players to see it through to its end. Beyond the ring, there were no additional rewards added since the shipyard launch, at least none that I know of, so there wasn't a whole lot to do with it after that. In retrospect, I think the garrison on its own was okay. If we clear our heads and separate it from the rest of the Warlords expansion, it was a collection of systems that showed decent promise. It leaned heavily on the side of convenience, but it basically delivered on its original statement. More meaningful updates could have improved the experience, but realistically, it was part of the Warlords expansion. I've been talking about what the garrison meant for players. Now I'm going to go back and go over what the garrison meant in relation to the rest of the expansion. The different systems of the garrison delivered rewards and resources through various means. These could also be obtained out in the world, but there was a big problem. Reward systems at the start of Warlords were straight up inferior. Let's start with dungeons. Dungeons rewarded gear and pushed a few quest lines along, and that's it. The Dungeon Daily awarded garrison resources at the start, which is okay, but garrison resources aren't as tangible as other rewards. Historically, by the end of a dungeon, players would have received more meaningful things like valor or materials for their profession. Garrison resources could be traded in a more roundabout way, but in the end, it was a poor replacement. And it's much more convenient to use the lumberyard, trading post, and salvager followers to amass resources. I mentioned valor, but it wasn't even a thing at the start of Warlords. Apexis crystals were the sort of new currency as it could be traded for starting gear and different rep rewards, but cost of the gear was extremely high, and the gear itself, it sucked. Obtaining Apexis was the chore as well, since the fastest way to earn it was through the assault objectives, which players found unintuitive and disconnected from the story narrative. I don't remember buying a single thing with Apexis early on because it took so damn long to earn it, and by the time I could, I was already raiding and I surpassed the reward system. Meanwhile, the garrison provided a potential gear upgrade every 2 weeks from raid caches. Starter crafted gear was also a far superior avenue to focus on. So thanks to the gross miscalculation of rewards management, Apexis was a currency with no value until Hellfire Citadel was launched. Regarding professions, previous expansions required players to go out into the world or into dungeons to farm for special non-gathering materials. In Warlords, though, the materials were conveniently facilitated by the garrison. Too conveniently. Herbs and ore, garrison. Cloth and leather, garrison. Sure, players could go outside to farm for this as well, but what for? The profession system in Warlords was designed to be restricted by the amount of unique resources players could generate per character, and this is a mostly finite number, based on the profession level and work orders available. In other words, players only had to farm for as long as they needed to in order to maintain their cooldowns. And this was really easy to do in practice, and didn't require players to leave the garrison often, if at all. So oftentimes players generated excess resources for a rainy day that seldom came. All those things, as well as missions, fell under the umbrella that is offline progression, or maintenance over gameplay, or the Facebook argument. Log on, complete and start missions and work orders, do whatever you're going to do outside the garrison, and log off. I still stand by the idea that this sort of gameplay is okay, so long as everything else is okay too. But it wasn't. Most of the available content outside the garrison was lacking. Dungeon rewards expired too quickly. Rep rewards were only cosmetic, and the factions themselves had too little narrative and context. Nearly every resource was quickly obtained through the garrison. Invasions didn't offer strong rewards, and the different garrison buildings only provided so much gameplay until their use was exhausted. When the smoke cleared, there wasn't much left except for missions, which, as I said earlier, is clever, sustainable content, but it provides zero gameplay. It's worth mentioning that a few features were introduced later in Warlords that proved to be worthwhile systems. Time-walking dungeons aren't meant to be a replacement for progression, but it was a way to breathe life into content long expired, and maybe not experienced at all but by newer players, and the gear wasn't bad. Mythic dungeons have shown to be a more effective group-based system of gearing. From the looks of it, both of these systems are going to show up in Legion, which should make for effective early launch content. But by the time these systems came out in Warlords, the damage was done. The memes were written, and the largest subscription spike in WoW's history was followed by its largest dip. Critics tore into Warlords of Draenor as one of, if not, the worst expansion of WoW's history. I want to say that the Garrison system isn't like a Facebook or a mobile game. Those types of games have hard limits on what you can do before you can run out, and then you gotta just wait and do nothing until you can do things again. Unless you throw down real money or harass your friends for extra turns, but I digress. WoW isn't a simple mobile game, because after you've completed all your garrison chores, you go out into the world and do other things. Regarding this expansion's execution though, it's really close to one. There might be other things to do because this is an MMO with other content out there, but at the moment, none of it is worth more than a garrison spec'd for treasure hunting. The problem with garrisons isn't that it was an awful system, it's that it wasn't a good system, but it was better than almost everything else, and that made everything worse. Except for raiding, because we were good there. Whew. So that's my take on garrisons, or well, most of the expansion. I'm grateful that you made it to the end, and would enjoy getting your thoughts on this, so drop a comment down below. Of course, please show your support with a like and a sub, and I'll see you guys next time when I reimagine all of WoW with world-scaling tech. It'll be fun, believe me. I'm Soul. Stay breezy, guys.